Daniel Ricciardo is one of the most loved Formula One drivers on the grid, especially by current Formula One champions Red Bull. And his return to Red Bull's sister team in 2023 had everyone predicting that we were set to see a reunion between Ricciardo and Verstappen once they could get rid of Sergio Perez. However, with the start of the 2024 season not going how he or Red Bull expected, the Australian finds himself once again unsure of his future in the sport. So what's going on with Daniel Ricciardo? Is he still the first choice for the second Red Bull seat, or are we looking at the end of the Australian's Formula One career? We all know that despite driving for RB this season, Daniel Ricciardo's primary objective is to impress Red Bull and secure a return to the team that he left over 5 years ago, to be back alongside Max Verstappen in 2025. And we have to remember, he left the team one of the hottest prospects on the Formula One grid, and many regarded him as a future Formula One world champion. In fact, if it hadn't have been for the domination of Mercedes, he probably would have been at least in the conversation for winning one whilst he was at Red Bull. However, since leaving, he's tried to rebuild a Renault team that, let's face it, is absolute chaos, so he was never going to win a championship there, and then he moved to McLaren where he just couldn't get the car to work for him, leading to him being booted out of the team and out of the sport with a year still on his contract. But Daniel Ricciardo was handed a lifeline when he initiated his mission to not only get back onto the Formula One grid, but impress Red Bull during the 2023 season. At first, this was demonstrating his skills on the Red Bull simulator, helping the team behind the scenes, but thanks to an incredible performance at the Silverstone tyre test, where he was nearing Max Verstappen's pace in the RB19, he was subsequently given the opportunity to replace Nick de Vries mid-season at AlphaTauri, and he made it very clear that this marked the beginning of his efforts to re-establish himself within the Red Bull system and get that seat which is currently occupied by Sergio Perez. However, that 2023 season really didn't go how any of us expected it to. Not only were Daniel Ricciardo's aspirations of getting into the Red Bull seat hampered just after the summer break, which was when we thought we were going to get to see the real Daniel Ricciardo return, thanks to a crash in Zandvoort that resulted in him missing 5 races, it also gave Liam Lawson a huge opportunity to put himself in the mix, because let's face it, before his incredible performances, including a point-scoring position in Singapore, not many people would have had Liam Lawson as a name that absolutely needed a place on the Formula One grid, meaning he's lost a lot of the momentum that was helping him progress towards reclaiming that Red Bull seat, and he's inadvertently put a target on his back, because if he doesn't perform, RB have a ready-made replacement that they know can do a job in that car. Progressing into this season, I think one thing that a lot of people underestimated, and possibly Daniel Ricciardo underestimated as well, is that Yuki Tsunoda is going to be a significant obstacle for Daniel Ricciardo to have to get past if he really wants to achieve those Red Bull aspirations. I think for Red Bull to be certain of Daniel Ricciardo and him being the right man for them moving forwards, he has to outperform Yuki Tsunoda convincingly. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of questions as to why they didn't just pick Yuki Tsunoda, who, let's not forget, is a Red Bull junior as well, and is a lot younger. Plus, Tsunoda's strong performances at the beginning of last season and this season highlight that there's a real level of competition within that team. And if Daniel Ricciardo does want to get one over on his Japanese teammate, he needs to elevate his driving significantly. And I know it's a small sample size, we've only had 2 races so far this year, and there are 22 races to go, so a lot could change, but there are a few things that I'm worried about that remind me more of McLaren Ricciardo than Red Bull Ricciardo. And I should know, I saw him squander points for us for 2 years. The most obvious gap between the 2 RB drivers so far this season is in qualifying. Across the opening 2 Grand Prix weekends of 2024, Yuki Tsunoda has consistently outperformed Daniel Ricciardo in qualifying sessions. In Bahrain, Yuki Tsunoda started in 11th to Daniel Ricciardo's 14th and was a 10th and a half quicker. Then in Saudi Arabia, Daniel Ricciardo started 14th again, but was 5/10ths off the pace of his teammate who started in 9th. And that gap in Saudi Arabia is incredibly telling, especially when you delve into the data a little bit closer. The majority of that 5/10th deficit to his teammate came in the first sector alone, which if you look at the Saudi Arabian track is the only sector that isn't heavily dependent on straight line speed. Sector 1 is full of high speed, sweeping corners that really test a driver's confidence in their car, especially with the walls being millimeters away from you if you're following the perfect racing line. Now, Daniel Ricciardo is known as the latest of late breakers when it comes to his racing style, but actually something that I've noticed in his qualifying is that he likes to brake a little bit earlier than the rest, and actually try and carry a bit more speed through the corners, which also requires a lot of confidence in the car that it's going to stick to the track and the tyres are going to hold on even though you're carrying a bit more speed. So I think we're looking at a Daniel Ricciardo that isn't 100% comfortable in the setup of that RB car and doesn't trust it to brake and carry the speed through the corners in the way that he wants it to, which is something that massively impacted his time at McLaren, where again he was in a car that he just couldn't trust to go through the corners the way that he wanted to drive it. Now, when it comes to the races both weekends, they've been ruined by various incidents, so it's difficult to get a real grasp on where he is, because in Bahrain he went for a different strategy to the majority, and then of course he had what I'm sure will soon become a very infamous team orders incident behind Yuki Tsunoda, which halted his progress on the soft tyres. Whether or not he'd have actually got past Kevin Magnussen, I'm not sure. And then in Saudi Arabia, Daniel Ricciardo was subject to a 40-second pit stop, which put him at the back of another Kevin Magnussen train and killed any chance of getting anything out of the race, because he definitely wasn't getting past Kevin Magnussen that time, whether Kevin Magnussen's defense was legal or not. However, there was also an incident that Daniel Ricciardo does have to acknowledge as his fault that also occurred in Saudi Arabia, where he lost the RB car and spun at the first corner. It was somewhat poetic that the spin occurred in front of Sergio Perez as the Mexican was driving towards his second comfortable podium finish of the year. But again, looking at the fact that it was the first sector, one of the most important braking zones on the track, I think compounds the theory that Daniel Ricciardo just can't rotate this car in the way that he wants it to. And he himself has been quite mixed when it's come to discussing his races. Whilst he's acknowledged his role in underperforming on results, he has also pointed at some of the car's limitations and emphasized the impact of external factors on his ability to actually deliver the results we've expected from him. And he does have a point. We all expected the RB car to be much more competitive than it is in 2024, given the upgrades we saw at the end of 2023 and the positive trajectory that the team seemed to be on going into the winter break. But I'm not sure that he can start fully blaming the car until he also starts to outperform Yuki Tsunoda, because at the moment the Japanese driver is getting more out of the machinery that they've been given. And I do want to emphasize once again, it's still very early on in the season and it's very premature to draw conclusions about Daniel Ricciardo's ceiling in this RB car and whether or not he'll be able to put together more performances throughout the season that start to show he's worthy of that Red Bull seat. But those performances need to start coming sooner rather than later. The biggest factor in all of this, and Daniel Ricciardo returning to Red Bull, is something a little bit out of Daniel Ricciardo's control. On one hand, there's clearly a positive relationship between Daniel Ricciardo and Red Bull, with Christian Horner having an incredible relationship with Ricciardo. If you haven't seen the most recent series of Drive to Survive, there are a few episodes that point towards Horner having a massive impact on Daniel Ricciardo getting into that AlphaTauri seat last year. But at the same time, Red Bull have a reputation of being very harsh on their drivers when they aren't performing, particularly one Helmut Marko, who has already in Saudi Arabia highlighted the urgency for Daniel Ricciardo to put together some better performances after just 2 races this year. When you're not meeting Helmut Marko's expectations, that adds a huge amount of pressure to deliver results and justify your position in the team, especially when you aspire to have the second Red Bull seat. Daniel Ricciardo's performance at the upcoming Melbourne Grand Prix, his home race, will be pivotal in shaping his future at Red Bull. I think it could either kickstart his season, the home crowd behind him, allowing him to demonstrate his full potential and secure his place within that team, or the pressure could start mounting and he could recognize the importance of getting a good performance in when the number of races is slowly starting to tick away and the spiral of pressure and poor performances could start to kick in, meaning if he's not careful, we could be looking at the final season of Daniel Ricciardo's Formula One career. But having said all that, I'd love to know what you think. Can Daniel Ricciardo turn around this season and prove to Red Bull that he's worthy of that second seat? Or are we seeing the end of Daniel Ricciardo's Formula One career? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, I also made this video here where I talked about a few of my concerns about this new RB team coming into the 2024 season and why Red Bull might eventually sell this team in the future. So click that link and I'll see you over there.